If you're not familiar with Gnosis, it's one of the oldest OG Ethereum projects.
It was obvious to me, this thing is changing everything. Computer programs that control money directly, and that was just mind-boggling for me.
I've seen it pitched a little bit as a better version of Tor.
One liner of HOPR is basically built anonymous communication protocol that is Web3 native and incentivized. Yeah, I guess you could frame it as a better version of Tor.
What are the main areas of security that you think about most?
Why is it that I need to scan my passport and send a utility bill to disclose that I'm not a terrorist? Like, that's absolutely stupid, because obviously North Korea can break that. I do think that we can build technologies that keep the bad guys out better. Any normal human out there is not fine with the privacy assumptions that Ethereum has to make.
All right, hey everybody, thanks for joining. Today we have Sebastian Bürgel with us. He is the VP of Technology at Gnosis and the founder at HOPR. If you're not familiar with Gnosis, it's one of the oldest OG Ethereum projects, you could say. They were responsible for building Safe, CowSwap, and a bunch of other cool apps. Gnosis Chain. Safe has done over $1 trillion in transaction volume. CowSwap has done over 100 billion in DEX volume. So some of the most critical and important infrastructure in the entire space has been built by Gnosis. And HOPR is a really interesting company as well. It's the tech behind the Gnosis VPN, and they're essentially trying to build something like a better version of Tor, but I'm sure Sebastian can give us an even better overview of it. Great to have you here, Sebastian, and yeah, would love to dive into your background.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, so, would love to hear, where are you from? How did you first get into computers, even before we start talking about crypto or anything like that? What does it look like to grow up as Sebastian?
Well, that's an interesting question. How did I get into computers? I felt I got into computers quite late, actually, when I was maybe 12, 13, and that felt like I missed out on so much already. I specifically later on felt like I missed out on all that, .com times. And, that led to me telling myself very clearly early on, if ever anything that crazy came along again, I would drop everything that I would do and jump right in. And I grew this conviction, basically since pretty early age, that, I would just keep my eyes open and jump into anything like that. And so I think I started coding when I was maybe 13 or 14 and just loved it ever since. It was just an incredibly creative thing for me to just create code. And then, fast forward over many years, after I basically finished my PhD, there was a conference called Ethereum DevCon 1 that happened in London. It was the week just after I finished my PhD, and I saw that moment again. I saw that there was something like this crazy .com times, and it was called crypto, or more specifically Ethereum for me. And I was it was very clear to me that, this is something like that again. And I now have to drop everything I do and jump right in.
Awesome. Yeah. Excited to get to that. I guess when you were getting into programming, what were you building? Was it websites in the early .com boom, or was it something else?
No, it was not. So I started on QBasic, this kind of beginner friendly language, and we're doing a game, a very simple game of something like strategy games. And I soon figured out that QBasic is just pretty shit at games, and I need something that is more capable, and got into C and C++ just because of that. Just because I thought gaming is always something that, drove me. And through that, then got to, web technologies again because of gaming and, browser games and MMOGs, massive multiplayer online games was something that fascinated me for a long time. For playing, for building bots, for building my own MMOGs. So yeah, that was really something I did for quite a while.
Awesome. Awesome. The number of people who got into either crypto or crypto security from gaming, either hacking video games, building them. It's probably over 50% of the people I've had on this podcast so far. It's kind of crazy, actually.
I can see that. And also, like, why would you be interested in hardware, right? I can tell you why I was interested in hardware, because the games that, I had weren't running on my computer, and I needed to get a new graphics card, and I needed to get a better CPU and all that stuff, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then so you're from Switzerland, you go to ETH Zurich, is that right? And do computer science. And then you had some pretty crazy stuff going on in the PhD, at least difficult to understand. What was the journey from what looked like, a more normal computer science, like undergraduate degree, into where you went next?
Yeah. So my undergrad it's called information technology and electrical engineering. So it was kind of a, mashup of both IT and EE. And yeah, I pivoted towards biomedical engineering in my master's and followed through in that in my PhD, which was basically microtech and for biomedical applications. And I really like using technologies for just changing something on the planet. And I was just always fascinated by that, seeing how we have Moore's law that basically says, that computers and like processors and stuff get better and like double in their like transistor count, for example, every 18 months. Like that's exponential growth, right? And the cutting edge, nowadays it's like our GPUs and CPUs, they leave behind this long tail of technologies that are super rapidly outdated. And the question was, can we use all of this relatively cheap technology for something entirely different? And that was super fun to see that we can use, for example, lithography, right? So these optical and chemical processes to build microtech, including GPUs and CPUs, but use something that's a few years behind and is now very cheap for totally different applications. And yeah, there's this whole kind of R&D field that does exactly that. And what I did was use this technology to build kind of microfluidic devices. So instead of using that to work on silicon chips, we built kind of polymeric devices to study cells, for example, cancer cells in very controlled environments. And later on, we studied kind of microorganisms. So, there's a bunch of kind of parasites that are, you might catch, and you want to develop drugs to fight these parasites, right? And how do you do that? Well, currently people do this in pretty messy and subjective environments to expose these parasites to drugs, but at the same time, ideally also not, kill your entire body. So we built microchips to simulate your body and test drugs on them. And that's what we did to improve the drug testing pipeline for diseases in tropical and subtropical regions, which I still think was something of the most rewarding things I ever worked on.
Wow. Okay. That's super interesting, I guess. So you talked a little bit about how you got into it. What was kind of the, conclusion of that chapter of your life, or did something in crypto kind of just take it over? What happened there?
Yeah, I mean, it was really me. I mean, I really absolutely enjoyed what I do. I know there's a bunch of people who are burned out by academia and whatnot. And I mean, sure, academia has its issues, but that was not it for me. For me, it was really, as I said, I saw crypto come in. I tried to combine the two sides. I actually wrote like a research plan of how we can bring, how we bring kind of some parts of decentralized technologies kind of into this academic world. I participated in, I think it was the first Ethereum hackathon in 2015, and built like I think I call it D-Lab book, like a decentralized lab book for, integrity and authenticity of scientific results. And that was before there was kind of all this blockchain in science movement. So yeah, we were fooling around that. But kind of my supervisor back then, my professor told me like, Sebastian, I think he literally said, Sebastian, I'd be happy if you keep your esoteric hobbies outside of work. And I was like, well, I guess then I have to change my work, right? And I did. So, was diving into crypto to go full time on that because again, it was obvious to me. This thing is changing everything. This crypto is just so different. I can now code directly, like computer programs that control money directly. And that was just mind boggling for me. And so I knew I just have to dive in. There's absolutely nothing else I could do. I just have to.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I agree. I guess, was it a difficult transition? Did you ditch your PhD? Did you have a period where you're like, man, I just have to get it done so I can move into crypto, or how did that work?
Yeah, it was actually really lucky. So I defended my PhD, I think on a Friday. On Monday, there was this Ethereum DevCon 1 starting in London, which was not far off away from Zurich. And that week after I graduated, nobody really cared what I would do. So I would just, go there and hang out and figure out why the Solidity compiler just doesn't do anything. And, so that for me it was really good timing. I had a research grant to start my postdoc. It was meant to work on, and there, we had some PhD students working with me then. And I had to quit that. I had to unfortunately drop that and, leave that. First, I took like a 3-month kind of unpaid vacation to figure things out. And I came back and it was just, I have to quit for good because this crypto thing is real. And I started actually, kind of consulting, and when we gave Ethereum workshops and teaching people Solidity and playing with it ourselves. So that's how we started. It was kind of hard to make a living off of that, but if you live off a PhD salary, it's not exactly that you drop out of Goldman Sachs and have to, keep up that salary level. So maybe that made it a bit easier.
Right. Got it. Okay. So this is 2015, maybe 2016. I mean, as early as it gets almost in terms of the Ethereum space. What do you remember from back then? Like, what do you have any crazy stories? Did you meet Vitalik at some point? Like, what was it like?
I mean, basically for me, it was, by the way, it didn't feel early. It like working then, it felt like, okay, like obviously the big bucks were made, right? There were all these Bitcoin whales and stuff like, Ethereum was basically just another shit coin, just like there were many other shit coins. And, for some reason I would believe in this one shit coin called Ethereum. And yeah, so that was a bit strange. And also just realizing how bad things were back then, is kind of unimaginable. As I said, like the Solidity compiler at DEFCON 1 times, when something wouldn't compile, it would just tell you there's an error. Like there would be no way of you knowing what you just fucked up in this like super early version of Solidity. And like if you wanted a wallet, you literally had to run Geth, right? So there was no MetaMask. Like you're literally running Geth, and you obviously had no debugging or testing tools. So you would actually test on Ethereum mainnet in production then, right? So like, I mean, I burned through a lot of ETH just, deploying helloworld.sol on Ethereum mainnet and figuring out what happens. And, also just, calling, like sending a transaction to just, make calls and obtain values because that was the most convenient. It's just like, that shit we did. So if you dig into what happened when Ethereum actually activated transfers, you see a bunch of stuff that you look at today, maybe in smart contracts, and like, what the fuck were people doing back then? It was, well, we were trying to build something with, blindfolded and the hands tied behind our backs. And, that's how it looks like to literally build in production back then. It was very fun. It was very fun, but also very slow. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. And where did you go from there? You were doing some consulting. You were, I think you said, helping out on like some workshops with early Ethereum or early Solidity.
Exactly. So we started off actually with we started kind of a firm that was doing only kind of workshops early on. And, then we got a bunch of requests from people who wanted us to build stuff. And we're like, no, we don't build stuff. We just do education. But then we got a bunch of requests. So being based in Switzerland was kind of interesting because there were a bunch of requests that we didn't understand at first what exactly they wanted. And eventually, after we got and kind of declined the 10th request, there was a pattern. And the pattern that emerged was people always wanted the same thing. And what they wanted was, hey, Sebastian, can you build us a token contract and a crowd sale contract? So that was kind of the onset of the ICO craziness. And people came typically to Switzerland to set up their foundations, had their lawyers in Switzerland, and us being based there, like a bunch of people came our way to, build ERC20.sol and crowdsell.sols and, sell that for money. So that was interesting. That was educational because, again, we could build with this technology from the earliest stages. But at the same time, it was also a bit disheartening because if you look at ICOs, there was a bunch of really low quality crap, frankly, out there that people raised money for. If you can't even build an ERC20.sol and a crowdsell.sol and need a consulting company for that to build it for you, well, generally, like the quality of these projects was pretty low. And so we got paid to build that stuff, which was great, and learn and get paid for learning and building early technology and grow a team for that. That was cool. It was intense, but it was also not the greatest project. So for me, it was always clear I don't want to remain a service provider in that space. I want to build something that makes sense here. But it was pretty hard to see what made sense. So these early projects that were discussed there, so I remember even at DEF CON 1 times, there were people talking about a DAO, and I didn't quite get it, but it was a contract that should collect a bunch of money and then, fund developments in the space. And as it happened, well, that was the first and biggest exploit that we've seen on Ethereum, which had far-reaching consequences of the DAO hack, which I guess most listeners of exactly, this podcast here are very familiar with, but it was by far the biggest hack in ETH land, like at least in ETH terms. And seeing that unravel from people talking about it to like, oh, that's actually real, to this having a crazy percentage of all ETH in circulation in this one contract and then go bust, that was insane. That was literally insane to see. And I'm very happy we came out of it because back then I remember the day, I remember starting my Geth node and I knew something was off when I heard my CPU spin more than it normally did, right? Because there would be a ton of transactions that my node was processing and I knew something was off. And then I checked, I don't know, back then if it was already on Twitter or elsewhere, and it was okay, there was something that didn't go as planned.
Wow. I watched a few of your talks and I got the sense that, you've got pretty strong, I would say, cypherpunk values. And so it seems like maybe you and some others were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into the, Ethereum. Essentially, maybe you would have wanted Ethereum Classic or you would have not wanted a hard fork, essentially. And you and others maybe got dragged into Ethereum after that.
I mean, to me, it was kind of so clear that this is so dramatic that first and foremost, they wanted Ethereum to survive. And so, yes, I mean, this hard fork was something that I felt a bit uneasy about. But, at that moment, I was 100% committed to Ethereum. Ethereum was I dropped my prior career in academia for Ethereum. I was 100% intellectually invested in Ethereum. So that thing had to survive. And it was very, very unclear if we would survive that. So literally, I mean, now with hindsight, it's oh, Sebastian, you're, exaggerating. Obviously, Ethereum was going to survive that. But at that moment, no, it wasn't. Maybe that was the end. And, maybe regulators would come after us and then that would be the end. Or, China banned Ethereum again and that was the end. So it was, the hard fork was something that was really problematic. But again, Ethereum surviving was paramount.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay. And then how do you go from there to the early idea of HOPR and the early execution of it?
Yeah. So kind of as we've been building kind of, ICOs for money, if the company didn't go bust before they paid at least, It was kind of obvious that there was a small number of projects that actually wanted to build a decentralized world computer. And that was honestly something how Ethereum was pitched to me. That was the Ethereum pitch at DEF CON 1 was Ethereum is a world computer, right? And the world computer does a bunch of things. It settles financial transactions. The blockchain is kind of obvious. But the world computer also has storage, right? So that was called Swarm, a project that's still around but separate from EF. And the world computer needs to talk to its other components, a project that back then was called Whisper. And then EF kind of ran out of money. So that's something that I think people also forget, right? EF was broke. EF had to kind of fire teams, kill projects. And that was another reason. Would Ethereum survive? Like they're run by kind of an obviously broke foundation. So how's that going to play out, right? And then like a few years later, there were projects who built decentralized compute, decentralized file storage. There would also be, IPFS coming up. There was, Golem was one of the early ones that, was out there to have decentralized compute and a few others. But to me, the thing that was not solved was, well, how do you communicate with a decentralized world computer? How does Alice talk to Bob in this thing? And I just looked at the technology stack, and that was the obvious one to me that was kind of missing and didn't have a clear answer. Because also Whisper, this protocol that was, then somehow, died or deprecated or just not actively pursued. It was meant more for broadcasting data. And there was no go-to solution for kind of Web3 native point-to-point communication. And that was kind of the onset of HOPR. Trying to find an answer for that.
Got it. And would you call, was the early version of HOPR, you've pitched it, or I've seen it pitched a little bit as a better version of Tor. Was that the early pitch? Is that still the pitch?
Yeah, it basically is the one-liner of HOPR is basically built anonymous communication protocol that is Web3 native and incentivized, right? And I guess you could frame it as a better version of Tor, better in the sense of more anonymous, better in the sense of better trust guarantees, and, with fewer central points of failure. So meaning there is no directory authority that can be compromised, which Tor has, which is basically a bunch of people who have to sign off on kind of a list of Tor nodes. And, also better trust assumptions, and that you don't just have to trust the first and the last node not to collude. Yeah, these were all specific things that we wanted to improve upon. And we thought, well, since we have now decentralized incentive settlement layers and decentralized peer-to-peer network infrastructure, that this is the right time to do that.
Got it. And obviously that it's a little bit controversial. Privacy in general in crypto and outside of crypto is a controversial topic in some senses. How do you think about, building a protocol like that in the midst of a lot of different governments and agencies that are trying to put backdoors in everything so there can't be real privacy? How do you philosophically think about that?
First of all, let me disagree here. Privacy is not controversial. Privacy is absolutely needed. The only people who don't care about privacy are kind of some DeFi degens, which care about money, and otherwise they don't care about absolutely anything, right? Any normal human out there is not fine with the privacy assumptions that Ethereum has today. If you go to an average Joe on the street and say, hey, why didn't you use this crypto wallet for everyday payments? Everyday Joe is going to understand that, going to a supermarket and paying for something, but then the supermarket, the clerk there seeing their balance is just absolutely stupid and they don't want that.
Yeah.
So privacy is something that the general public understands and demands. And I think for some reason, we ended up in this weird narrative in crypto that, well, the only thing that matters is making money. No. Building digital technologies is something that matters for a lot of people, primarily not to make money, but just to interact with humans and to, have digital commerce and have digital gaming and have, digital culture and, digital democracies increasingly. All of that needs privacy, and everybody understands that, and it's not even a question. We just have to level up on all fronts to deliver that for, humans on this planet. And, so to me, it's just a natural thing. It's a natural thing that is underserved, and we just need to provide for it. And it's a bit it's very unfortunate that, especially in the US, there has been a backlash for at least some time. It seems we're, hopefully past that. Although, Roman's, appeals are still pending. So we'll see how that goes, right? It feels good to build privacy because I know humans want and need and demand privacy. And I would hope more people would do that on all fronts and all layers of the stack.
Yeah. Makes sense. I guess, do you see, I think a lot of the narrative around blockchain, especially with government agencies, sometimes the US, is about, hey, it's transparent. You can see the bad guys interacting. You can actually catch them more easily because you see exactly where the funds are going. Do you think this was sort of an accidental pitch and we just didn't have, was it intentional that there was no privacy on blockchains, or was it just that the tech wasn't ready yet?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I remember vividly, it's a number of years back now, there was an event hosted by the Swiss National Bank. And there was Michael Egeroff from Curve. They're on a panel and talking about exactly the point you just made. DeFi is great and crypto is great because you have this full transparency and, you can catch all the bad guys. This is fantastic. And I was like, talking to him afterwards, I was like, Michael, but that, and Vitalik is quite outspoken about it, that all of that is going to be, privacy respecting eventually. And, some of the smartest folks in the space are working towards that. And sure, he was aware of that, right? So I think it's just a very welcome argument, and everybody who's serious who works in crypto knows that, in 10 years from now, we obviously do not settle money on transparent ledgers, which disclose everything that everyone spends, publicly readable for anyone out there. I think it's a bit of Trojan horse. And the actual thing is, well, governments are not going to be in control anymore. And to me, that is great because nobody here wants to support terrorism. Nobody here wants to support organized crime. And I am very bullish on us being able to build technologies that are, technology controlled and technology enforced, instead of being enforced by absolutely bullshit, policies like AML. AML is the least effective, set of policies that humans have ever enacted. Why is it that I need to scan my passport and send a utility bill to make sure that, I'm to disclose that I'm not a terrorist? That's absolutely stupid because obviously North Korea can break that. Obviously, everyone who wants to launder, millions of dollars is not stopped by that at all. So all that stuff is just making the interaction between retail and all of this really hard. And I do think that we can build technologies that keep the bad guys out better than legacy laws and regulations and policies.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you on that. And taking some of that, responsibility away from governments is only a good thing, only going to help people. Okay. So building HOPR, obviously you're the VP of technology at Gnosis. How did that come about? How did you come into contact with the Gnosis team?
Yeah. I mean, obviously haven't been around Ethereum and been working in there. I've been very familiar with Gnosis for a very long time because Gnosis was basically the first product that actually worked on Ethereum, which was a prediction market that launched very soon after Ethereum launched, actually. In fact, I think the Gnosis founders had kind of a prediction market thing running already prior to Ethereum launching, but then Ethereum was kind of the technology that made that just way better. And so, kind of building HOPR, we were for a while looking, okay, what do we use as the settlement layer for this incentivized mixnet that we're building? And me being very exposed to Ethereum for a long time, the obvious answer was, well, Ethereum. And funnily enough, when we launched HOPR, that was just around the time when Ethereum gas prices would just explode. And there was just no way we would be able to settle for our little network any transactions on Ethereum if you have to pay $100 to, open a payment channel, or without getting into too much of the details, but like doing any of these things that was just completely prohibitive. And so we were having some kind of test runs on a bunch of networks. We checked out Polygon. We checked out Binance Smart Chain. Binance was one of the biggest investors in HOPR. And so that kind of made sense. And we figured, and we used another chain called XDAI chain. And like XDAI chain back then was the only thing that actually kind of worked reliably. And for the ones who don't know that, XDAI chain, XDAI, the project later on merged with Gnosis, and the chain was rebranded as Gnosis Chain. But it was kind of this chain which had this POA, this proof of authority kind of consensus algorithm, and was kind of otherwise a copy on the execution layer of Ethereum. And so we kind of happened to be operating on first XDAI chain and later, as it was called, Gnosis Chain, and we're working pretty closely with that team. Developing HOPR further, we also decided that what is actually the best way to secure your assets when you also run a node. And we decided that, well, the best infrastructure to do that is called safe, right? The multi-sig that we use. So every HOPR node is safe. We're running on Gnosis Chain. So we were kind of very closely aligned with everything that Gnosis is and does. And then culturally also, I think Gnosis founders and Gnosis as an organization, I think is probably, with maybe the only exception being MEV, kind of the closest aligned thing to my own thinking in this space. So it was a process that was, for me, it felt a little bit like coming home, working with Gnosis. And talking to Martin and talking about building a VPN. So Martin was very excited about having a kind of undetectable and maximally anonymous decentralized VPN being built. And that's really how we came together around building that product that is now called, that we're in the process of building, called Gnosis VPN. And then, talking to Martin, Frederic, and Stefan, they asked me, hey, okay, can we do more together? Because, Gnosis does a lot, and we would need some help on the technical leadership. And I helped them in that. And that's why I'm called VP Tech at Gnosis, where I don't just oversee the development of Gnosis VPN, but also other technical developments within Gnosis. From Metri, kind of this progressive web app wallet that we're building, to Gnosis Pay, this self-custodial Visa debit card, and a few other initiatives.
Got it. Well, and you're still the founder at HOPR, so you're a busy guy working on a lot of different projects, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say it's kind of interesting to see how things come together, because at HOPR, we have this. HOPR is kind of a hardcore cypherpunk product, right? So it's this like anonymity layer for the internet that settles on the blockchain. But it also means we don't want to work with RPC providers. We don't want to work with centralized indexers. We don't want to work with any of these increasingly sophisticated kind of centralized closed source data layers. So we really need to work with a bare bones Ethereum, or in that case, Gnosis Chain node, right? And kind of me working as VP Tech at Gnosis, where we really closely work with all the Ethereum client teams, is kind of cool, because one of the big consumers of these bare bones technology is HOPR, and having direct access to the dev teams there through kind of my joint role at Gnosis. There's a lot of synergies that I actually didn't see coming, but that are just really handy right now.
Got it. So you mentioned the term incentivized mixnet. Essentially, something like Tor is a mixnet. You're basically taking data packets and kind of mixing them up. And the incentivization part means that you're paying people to essentially move those packets along. Is that correct? Or run a node? Is that complementary to Gnosis VPN? Is it related in some way? Do those two products depend on each other, or are they pretty separate?
Yeah, let me quickly walk through the technology here and maybe some of the terms for the ones who are not familiar with it, right? So let's first say you just access a web service right now. What actually happens is you disclose to that web service as well as to your ISP what you're doing, who you are and what you're doing, right? Your IP address, which is basically your home address on the internet, as they say, is exposed. So what sometimes people do is they use a VPN, right? Which shields your IP address from the website. But it basically just means you give some server operator that operates the VPN server information of all apps and services that you're using, right? They see everything. Of course, they don't see your encrypted data, but they see from where you access what services and send how much data. So, if you use a VPN to access OnlyFans, I don't know. Do you really trust them to not disclose that? I don't know if you're okay with that. Now, to get one step better, there is something called Tor, right? What does Tor do? Instead of just having one VPN server, in Tor you have 3 hops. So when you use Tor, the Tor network, for example, through the Tor browser, your traffic is being sent to a guard node, like a first node, who sends your data packet that is encrypted, peels off kind of one layer of the encryption and sends it to the next one, who sends it to the exit nodes, who sends the actual request for some resource to a web server, and on the way back, the same thing back, right? That's Tor. And now at HOPR, we do exactly the same thing that we do at Tor, but with a few additional things here. And what we add is packet mixing. So you cannot just follow a packet as it hops through its network, because every packet and every hop is transformed and mixed up in other traffic. And therefore, it's way harder to kind of, figure out what resources I'm accessing on the web. So, but HOPR in and by itself, as I just described it, that's just technology. That's kind of low-level transport, a low-layer transport layer that you can use for anything. It's not a product directly that anyone would ever be able to use directly. So to use that and to make that useful, we're building Gnosis VPN on top of that. So Gnosis VPN, you will install it, and it's not live yet. The planned go live is some point Q2 next year. And you will be able to download a binary that, feels just like a kind of legacy centralized VPN, like NordVPN or whatever people might be familiar with. But actually what it does is it doesn't just send your traffic via one server to a website, but it sends you data packets through this decentralized mixnet and, changes paths rapidly and mixes up your traffic for having these much stronger anonymity guarantees than a VPN or even Tor has. So yes, basically HOPR is the underlying infrastructure that is leveraged when you use Gnosis VPN as a product. So imagine it a little bit like HOPR is kind of like the Ethereum and Gnosis VPN is like the MetaMask on top of it.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I guess as you're building these different technologies, working on these different products, how do you personally manage your time between all of kind of managing or building those different products and learning about new technologies?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm still figuring that out. So I like to. There's a bunch of things that are not just technology, but dealing with people and partners on the technology side. So there's that, right? This kind of just managing things overhead. Well, overhead, it's part of my job also, right? To deal with all of that. But to set up team structures and people that provide less work for me is just part of the job. And then it depends on. I like to kind of dive a little bit deeper and spend some more time on individual topics. So at times that is obviously when we have a new version coming up for HOPR or Gnosis VPN, it is spending time on the architecture of that. If there is, changes or things going on at Gnosis Chain, it is focusing on that. If there's a new version coming up at Gnosis Pay, like there are periods of time when I dedicate like most of my time to Gnosis Pay. So it's kind of like going around these projects with like temporal focuses on individual projects that I spend time on. Yeah, and trying to keep a balance there, because as we know, also in crypto, there's, every now and then there's things that go up in fire that you just didn't see coming. There's drama that you just didn't expect. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm still figuring out. And then there's so much to learn, right? As you said, there's so many new things that are coming up. Luckily, I would say at Gnosis, we have quite a broad exposure. We also have a VC arm of Gnosis called Gnosis VC. And yeah, so I'm involved there from the tech side as well. And yeah, we get a bunch of inbound of just interesting stuff that comes our way. I like to approach it from a practical side. Like, what do we actually need to ship consumer products that are Web3 aligned? And so how do I kind of pick the technologies that I'm interested in digging deeper into is from that angle. Like, what do I need today to build a better version of Gnosis VPN, a better version of Gnosis Pay, a better version of Metri, kind of this Gnosis central wallet? And yeah, that's how I dive into topics. Like, one topic that, I speak a lot about, even though I don't work on it directly myself, is indexers, right? Like, how can we build more resilient services so that when we build the next wallet, I don't just have to trust some HTTP API blindly with the data that it presents to me. And like, that's something, for example, that's one topic that I'm passionate about. And I think, I'm trying to convince people to build something that's better in that direction.
Got it. Yeah, I think I heard you say in some talk that one of the biggest either points of centralization or kind of points of development for Ethereum is that it's too reliant on indexers. Is that something you still feel strongly about?
Oh yeah, exactly. That's 100% what I mean. Like, so, I mean, there's this argument, oh no, you can just use Ethereum, and Ethereum is, building all this great tech so that you don't need to rely on anything, but that's not the truth, right? So if you actually, how are most people going to interact with Ethereum? They're not going to use Ethereum directly. They're going to use a wallet, right? And if your wallet relies on 20 other centralized services, and, outage of any one of these 20 centralized services basically breaks your money, that's just really bad. That's just a really bad experience, because at least temporarily you take, the agency away from people to move their money. So it shouldn't be that way. People they're just not going to be fine if you tell them, oh, you have, $10 in your wallet, when they know that they put in, $5K a few weeks ago. They expect you to be able to tell them, oh, you know what, there's only $10 left, because most of your money you moved into Aave because you want to, generate yield on your USDC, for example. And that is an example of something that is only possible to render in your wallet when you have access to an indexer making that information available. And yeah, that is an example of a layer that I would see become much more resilient, and really think through the whole stack. Like, how can we build wallets that are resilient again? I think I generally observe that people become just less ambitious and, a bit more lazy and just want to move fast. Yeah, sure, I want to move fast as well, but let's try to stay close to this goal of building resilient technologies, because otherwise we will just converge on building another Binance.com. And Binance.com is great. It works, but that's not what the Web3 is here for, right? So I'd really hope, not just with indexers, and index is just one example that I like to pick on, because it's like, yeah, I have been typing a bit into it. People have to get more ambitious and just not pick the next centralized service when you build whatever you build.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Obviously difficult to make users deal with worse user experiences if that's what you have to force them to do to use the proper technology. But obviously Gnosis, Ethereum, and others are trying to make that less of a burden for users. I guess speaking of that ethos, Ethereum is pretty aligned with it. Sherlock is launching the $2 million audit competition for the Fusaka upgrade of Ethereum. Gnosis is one of the biggest sponsors of that competition. Why was it important for you guys to be involved in that? Why was it important to sponsor it?
Yeah, I mean, Gnosis Chain is basically pretty much an exact copy of Ethereum. It's a, side chain of Ethereum that is consciously trying to contribute to making Ethereum better. I think the Ethereum alignment of people, when I say, Gnosis is basically a copy, it's like, no, we're not just a copycat of Ethereum. We're trying to kind of consciously make Ethereum better in any possible way. So, for example, what we did over the past couple of hard forks is on Gnosis Chain, these hard forks would get activated at least a couple of days earlier to, give Ethereum client devs, researchers, and users a chance to see how that stuff would actually play out in production in a real economically viable network. At Gnosis, we financially support since many years Ethereum client development teams like Nethermind or Aragon. At Gnosis, we have in-house core development, for example, for Reth, and are partially also supporting Geth client developments. So all of that is something that we're heavily invested in for many years. And also, I think what people don't recall is when Parity kind of dropped the ball and, dropped the Parity ETH client, which was back in the days kind of the second only Ethereum client. Gnosis, to a large degree, picked that up in building the Open Ethereum client. So we have for many years been contributing Ethereum and, trying to make Ethereum more secure, more resilient, more scalable on all fronts. And sponsoring the Fusaka Bounty contest for us was something that is very much in line with that. And frankly, we are going to run Fusaka also, right? So we better know if there's issues. So please contribute to that. If anybody has any capacity to dig into that, please do dig into that, because I don't want to see Ethereum get wrecked, and I don't want to see Gnosis Chain get wrecked either. So, it's important to take that security of that very seriously.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And obviously, you remember the times when the EF didn't have that much money. I think they're doing a little bit better now. ETH price is probably up from that point, but it's great that teams are coming together and kind of supporting what Ethereum is building, what so many people build on top of, or like you said, use the technology of. What are the, speaking of security, what are the main areas of security that you think about most, or that keep you up at night the most across any product you work on?
Which doesn't. I would say a lot of people here are focusing on smart contracts. And I'm very happy to see that smart contract exploits have gotten way better in the past months and years. So, that is, I think, a fantastic achievement of Sherlock and, all the other contributors in the space to smart contract security. That's incredible. What I am concerned about is, and I think this is a good week to talk about it, just as we've seen some NPM dependency exploit where basically some developer got social engineered. I think it was a social engineering attack to get access to the account of one developer to inject malicious code into a bunch of super popular packages that were distributed all over the place. And it's absolutely miraculous that has not led to huge damages. This is an example of something I am very concerned about. I am concerned about that we are moving fast, using established software development patterns of Web3 technologies, and clients and software packages that work very well for Web2, and that were, as I sometimes like to say, basically built to share funny cat images. And it is now used to secure trillion-dollar financial assets. I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about web technology is being used to directly control, custody over trillions of dollars of crypto assets. I think there's a whole lot of, software development, paradigms that have to be rethought to make that way more resilient. And the security of this entire stack, and the resilience of this entire stack, which is not just software development, but also like the whole technology around it, is something that I'm thinking about a lot. Obviously, I'm thinking about it from a privacy side, but I'm thinking about this from a security side as well. Like, there's lots of work ahead of us to get that better.
Yeah. Do you kind of think, what level do you think the protection should mainly come from? Because obviously the origin is the developer, who gets socially engineered, or the user who gets socially engineered. Probably hard to stop that 100% forever, because there's just so many ways to get access to somebody's password or whatever it is. Where in the stack do you see the protection needing to come from?
Yeah. So I will now focus not on the smart contract part. I think there's, you have a bunch of content and stuff where people talk about that part. I will talk about the app itself. Let's pick as an example app.uniswap.org, right? As a popular one. Like fast forward, my dream scenario is that the canonical UI for that one is app.uniswap.eth, right? Now, how does that work? You open your browser, you type app.uniswap.eth. That's it. So first problem here is your browser currently doesn't speak ENS, and it should speak ENS. It should do, at least light client verification of the results that it gets for the result of app.uniswap.eth, so that cannot kind of get maliciously changed. The second problem is you get an IPFS hash, and that IPFS content has to be obtained. Second problem, your browser doesn't natively speak IPFS. That has to be changed to increase the resilience of the content that is actually being fed. And then, the question is, then we get to the part, well, where does that content from app.uniswap.eth actually come from? And I would hope that there is kind of a security alliance of sorts that, signs off on changes to the app development, and not just one developer account that gets wrecked and then, app.uniswap.eth is now a malicious drainer version. And ideally, I would see in my browser or in my wallet that, the following 20 security researchers that I trust and follow, have ticked off on this release, and maybe there's some part of a reward or part of my fees that I spend on app.uniswap.eth is then being distributed to these security researchers as well. Anyway, I'm just drawing a picture here. But I would hope we get towards such a direction where technology is locally verified directly on the user's devices in the wallet or browsers that the user is actually using, with the best possible trust assumption, all the way to the actual software kind of deployment process and kind of security audit process that is kind of directly integrated and transparently available all the way to the user. Just like, HTTPS, like your browser, like when you open a website today, right? We had like the kind of check mark. And nowadays we went that far that your browser wouldn't even render a page if it has an invalid HTTPS certificate.
Right.
If I think about that, like that is very complicated, but browsers abstract all of that away for us. I would hope we get to the same level of decentralized applications on Ethereum. Got
it. Yeah, that's an interesting vision. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And having, I don't know how you described it, a multi-sig or a council for updating the production version of app.uniswap.eth, so that one person at least can't just inject malicious code there. Yeah, I think that it all makes sense. And on the other hand, it all adds extra steps for the developer team. Hopefully not for the user. Like you said, the browser can abstract a lot of things away. How do you think about that trade-off? Well, we think about it a lot as a service provider. And I think you noticed it back when you were, doing workshops, or you were a service provider. You can't control what other companies do. How do you think about that in terms of how do you convince DeFi protocols to go that extra mile and to have like a council sign off on every update they ship to their front end?
I just think we have to push harder for all of that. We have to push harder for apps to not just rely on centralized services. We have to push harder for apps to establish best practices when it comes to audits, audit contests, and ongoing bug bounties. I would say on that, we made a lot of progress. So I do think this as a social norm that you don't like YOLO something into production that is just completely unaudited. That did happen. It did happen early on. There were a bunch of hacks. And again, like we got a lot better in that regard. I would still hope that there are more standards that are being established in the security side that can be exposed to apps. Maybe not all the way to users, because it's overwhelming if you expose something to a user and saying, look, this is, here's an audit by Sherlock, everything is fine, but have something that allows us to get that that green check mark or whatever, that something has gone through whatever best practices have been established or done. And I would hope we get there. And if you just YOLO something in production that has been audited by nobody, you would just, like, your browser or wallet would just refuse to open it. Just like my browser today refuses to open an HTTPS site, which an invalid certificate. Like, that shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be possible. And I think that requires more standards to be, to be established around that to get us there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree. It makes sense. We do need to push harder and keep pushing once we make some progress. I guess shifting gears to another topic that you wrote about, I think even over 3 years ago before the merge, validator sniping in proof of stake. What can you tell us about that? Why are you passionate about, getting the word out around that when it comes to Ethereum?
What actually secures Ethereum is validators, right? So what is kind of important is the security of these validators. So, and, availability, because if your validator that produces a block is offline, then, well, there's just not going to be a block being produced. The problem is that these validators are known ahead of time. Ethereum validators are known ahead of time. And I know, let's say, Jack and Sebastian are running validators. Jack might just see, I produce a block in like 6 slots from now, and I'm producing a block right after Sebastian. That's just how Ethereum works. And there's some proposals to change that, but it's kind of hard. It's actually a hard problem. And Vitalik has some blocks on that. So one problem here is that it is not just known that, Sebastian is going to produce a block, more specifically, my pub key. You might not know it's me, but you see my pub key, right? But what you can do, in which we kind of demonstrated that we could do, is you can kind of run a beacon node that is data harvesting attestations, right? So this is a quick recap for the ones who are not super familiar with how the beacon chain works. Is like your node just doesn't just produce blocks every couple of weeks or months. It also, once per epoch, it signs off on another person's block, right? And this is called an attestation, and it's a signature. Now, what we've been doing is we kind of modified the Lighthouse client to data harvest these attestations. So it's basically getting these attestations, these signatures, and it's just noting from which IP it got. And chances are, when I collect to a lot of nodes out there, is that I happen to get Jack's signature most of the time from an IP address that's actually Jack, right? Sometimes I get it from somebody else because I wasn't directly connected to him, but I was connected to somebody else. In that way, I can identify Jack's IP address. And in the process, I link his pub key to his IP address so that when he produces a block, what I could do, for example, because I'm the validator right after, I could snipe him, right? I could launch a highly targeted, super short denial of service attack, for example, some little DDoS, because maybe you're a home validator, don't have a fallback. I could take you out, right? And MEV and high value transactions roll over to me. So I can do that profitably. That's pretty bad. And yeah, to me, that is an example of how Ethereum researchers and developers are oftentimes neglecting the network layer and leaving, kind of severe security issues that follow from that. Yeah, and obviously, I hope that one day we get HOPR there to be so low latency that we can use it to run a validator over it. At this point, that would not work just because the latency requirements for running a validator are kind of severe, and we are not sufficiently reliable and low latency yet to support that. But I do hope we get there, and that's just an example of making things more resilient by making it more anonymous on the network layer.
Got it. Well, I'm glad people like you are thinking about these things and continuing to push them, because I think 99% of the space, even the technical folks in Ethereum, you get complacent when you see things working and you see, we might call it a low severity or informational severity issue. And then, one day it becomes something that's a huge deal, and we didn't, it becomes maybe even the thing that breaks everything, the point of attack or the point of failure. So yeah, very interesting. And I'm glad that you and others are kind of pushing us to think hard about how we can solve those problems.
We will keep doing that. Because, as Ethereum and these blockchains get more complicated, there's more, system components that play with one another that lead to more complicated, attack vectors. And yeah, I'm happy to see that there's a lot of smart people that think about security and, also privacy and other issues in that space.
Yeah. I know we're running out of time a little bit here, but would love to get in a couple more questions. One that I like to ask: what is your most contrarian or controversial take on the Web3 security space, whether it's smart contracts or wallet level?
Contrarian take on the Web3 security space. I guess it is that people don't care about the user front end. And, it's fantastic that you paid a lot of money for your smart contract audit, and then you deploy it in some crazy way that, I can compromise a single developer account to just take it all down and inject a drainer. That's just wild. And that needs to change urgently, because, maybe a few $1 billion are not bad enough. Once we get to a few $1 trillion, this is going to get so much worse.
Yeah. Do you think audit firms, audit companies like Sherlock should be making that part of the audits we do? Do you think those firms should be putting more attention there?
100% yes. I would say, I would even go as far, not just on the software, but also on the software deployment setup, because maybe your, front-end implementation is top-notch. It's secure. It follows all best practices. But then, you deploy it in a Vercel instance that, your intern has access to with full root access with, password ABC123, and you're fucked, right? So really, broadening the scope towards full stack, but also towards these critical components of software deployment cycle is absolutely, I really do hope we level up there a lot. And I see a lot of extremely low hanging fruit wherever I look. So yeah, I really do hope that, you guys and others, provide that. And that's a standard. If you haven't actually gotten some seal of approval on what you do there, then I will not interact with your app.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And we've only seen it get worse, where you hire one engineer, or like you said, one intern. And I talked to one for the first time the other day, someone from, I don't know where, but probably North Korea, who was just pretending to be somebody else.
It's insane.
You get one of those guys in and you give them some permissions and it's over.
I mean, even that, right? It's so obvious. And I was shocked when I talked to HR at Gnosis, and I was like, is this really happening? And they told me, oh yes, all the time. So this is not something, I read it on Twitter and I was like, yeah, that's probably exaggerated, but no, that is real.
Yeah. the attacks are getting very creative. Okay, well, I guess in terms of what's next for you, what's next for HOPR, the Gnosis products you're working on, what area or feature are you most excited about?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly looking forward to Fusaka happening. First of all, on Gnosis Chain and Ethereum. On the Gnosis front, there is a focus to align Gnosis on consumer-facing products. So there's some rebranding and some refocusing on the Gnosis side coming up. So I will not leak too much, except for saying, Gnosis wallet will be at the core of it. And I guess in the next couple of months you will hear more about that. And for me personally, the biggest thing coming up will be around Q2 next year when we launch Gnosis VPN as an app that is the most cypherpunk app you can use without compromising on user experience. And I want to prove that. I want to prove people that cypherpunk does not mean crappy UX. But we're still a few months away from that.
Awesome. Well, I'm super excited for that. I know some on our team have been struggling with VPNs recently, and really looking forward to that launch and seeing a fully decentralized or permissionless or non-data sharing VPN that has a decent UX. That would be very, very cool.
I'll ping you once we got that, Jack.
Yeah, please do. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it, Sebastian. Thanks for joining, and looking forward to what you have cooking on the Gnosis side and on the VPN side as well.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for pushing security in the wider space, and cat herding all the folks around the Fusaka contest now, and other stuff that you do in the security front. Thank you.
Awesome. Really appreciate it.